If someone is missing shoulder IR, how do you decide if you load an exercise, either in the suitcase, low hold position, or the goblet position? Let's break this down very simply. We have to look at how reaching our arms in various degrees of flexion influences where air goes. Ergo, when I do a goblet hold, and I'm going to assume a goblet hold is between like 70 to 90 degrees of shoulder flexion. From 60 to 120 degrees, you have a relative bias in anterior chest wall expansion. The reason being is because with scapulohumeral rhythm, as you're raising your arm overhead from 60 to 120, the scapula has increased upward rotation and external rotation. Upward and then external rotation, meaning the medial border of the scapula is going to be pressed up against the rib cage. Muscles on the back side of your body, rhomboids, traps, those muscles will push the scapula up against the rib cage. Since they're located posteriorly, and if they're more concentric, it's going to be a lot tougher to get air into the back of the rib cage. But if you breathe in, you're still going to get air somewhere. That's where air goes in the front. Therefore, if I'm using a goblet hold and I have my elbows or my shoulders between 70 and 90 degrees of shoulder flexion, that's going to allow me to put more air in the front, assuming that you're not overpecking the reach. A lot of times when people do a goblet hold, if they bring the elbows in hard, they'll create a lot of tension in the pecs. If you have a lot of tension in the pecs, you're not going to get air in the front because the pecs depress the sternum, which is a concentric anterior thorax, meaning you aren't going to get air anywhere. A lot of times when that happens, people will feel neck tension. So if you're getting neck tension, you may want to check yourself and no longer peck yourself. Make sure you get the reach without engaging the pecs overly. The common issue that I see is when you're really trying to move the thorax posteriorly. And that's really like the fix for getting people to not overpeck it, because a lot of times when you're cueing the reach forward, they may just move the scaps without moving the thorax backwards. That's usually the issue. And if you move the scaps forward without getting that posterior thorax movement, the pecs will get overly engaged and problems ensue. You'll see this a lot when I coach a goblet squat on my YouTube channel, but one of my favorite cues is to make sure you shove your whole body backwards as opposed to thinking scapulae forward. So think, for those people, I need to move the body back, then get the stack, and if you do that, a lot of times that will reduce the pec overactivity that is often seen with a reach. Another good thing that you can do as well is also to teach reaches unilaterally. Now, you're not going to do that with the goblet hold, but maybe working on unilateral reaches without kicking in the pec. That can also be another great way to reduce pec overload or pec overactivity during these particular moves. Now, if you lower the goblet hold, you go with like a low goblet hold or a front rack position, and you're reaching less than 60 degrees, because the resting position of the scapula is in more internal rotation, that's going to allow more posterior expansion to occur because the scapula is IR'd. Those muscles are on slack. So you'll get more air posteriorly in that case with a low goblet hold. And if you want to dive a little bit deeper in terms of the degrees and why that happens, there's a great post I did on scapulohumeral rhythm. Definitely check it out. It'll be in the show notes. Goblet, 70 to 90, you're probably going to get air in the front. If it's a low goblet, you're going to get air in the back. Now, what's going on with a suitcase hold? And I'm talking suitcase carry, arm at the side. Guess what, folks? It doesn't have a whole lot to do with the arm that's holding the weight. The interesting thing about a suitcase carry and why it's effective has to do with the swinging arm. What happens is when you hold a weight in your hand, because that arm is fixed, it gives you a fixed point to rotate the thorax around. And this is one reason why I encourage a substantial arm swing when you're doing a suitcase carry, because you can really drive rotation around the thorax with a fixed arm. It's really cool. think of it as like I had a spin wheel. That would be a good example. So you know the wheels that you spin and you win a prize? The middle point that the spinner is spinning on would be your arm that's holding the weight. And then the rotational action happens to be the thorax, which is driven by the arm swing. So let's say my right arm is holding the weight and I'm swinging my left arm. If I reach my arm forward, my thorax is going to be rotating to the right because that rightward arm swing is going to orient the sternum to the left. When I rotate my thorax to the right, that's going to net me anterior expansion on the left side and posterior expansion on the right side. And the reason being is because when the spinous process moves to the left, so I'm rotating to the right, spinous process in the spine moves to the left, the stuff on the back is concentric on the left and eccentric on the right because your muscles that allow for posterior thorax expansion attach to the spine's process. So when you rotate your arm, you reach your arm forward, trunk rotates to the right, you get anterior expansion on the left, posterior expansion on the right. When I swing the arm back, now the thorax is rotating towards the left. When the thorax rotates towards the left, you get the reverse action. Now, because the spinous process is moving to the right, I'm going to get anterior expansion on the right side and posterior expansion on the left side. Now, depending on what you do with the arm that has the weight, that can also influence some expansion to some degree. If I'm shoving the arm in a little bit of flexion and the scapula is more protracted, that's going to allow for some posterior expansion. If you pull the shoulder blade back on the weighted side, that's going to allow for relative anterior expansion. But that's still a fixed point to which you are driving rotation in the thorax about. To summarize the differences between these positions, a goblet hold, if you're between 70 and 90, is going to get air in the front. A low goblet is going to get air in the back. And a suitcase hold, in assuming you're encouraging arm swing, which you should, is going to drive anterior and posterior expansion because the weight position is going to allow the thorax to rotate around that weight position. So it's a great move to get air into all quadrants of the thorax. Dan asks, Big Z, during the suitcase carry, how do you cue people to maintain the stack while they're walking? Ooh, this is a good one because a lot of times when people walk, they will inevitably arch their back. And the cues are very similar to what I would do with anyone else. A lot of it would be making sure they tuck, get an exhaled ribcage position, try to hold that tension in the abs that they get from that, and just make sure you're walking in that direction. A lot of times that works. If they're still struggling, maybe you need to do some things to just be able to get them to maintain the stack in standing. With a lot of the stuff that we're doing, reaching forward, tucking, squatting, a lot of that is putting the spine into a backwards position or is going to promote backwards locomotion. So I'll give you an example. A lot of times if you're doing a retro sled drag, well, you look like you're in a squat position when you're doing that. So it makes that a little bit easier to get that stacked position. But the issue is rarely now do we propel or teach our clients to propel forward and maintain the stack. So with that, anything you can do that improves hip extension, teaching them to keep the tucked position while they're pushing their leg back, that can be very effective at getting the pelvic component. And then same thing with your rows or anything that drives the arm backward, because the backside mechanics of the suitcase carry, when you're kicking your leg back or kicking your arm back, that's when someone is going to be predisposed to losing the stack position. So drilling activities that influence keeping the stack position while the arms are going back can be effective. So working on hip extension, split squats, working on rowing, those can help teach your clients to keep that position when they're walking. Could conceive of just having them hold an iso hold position with the suitcase. So maybe you have them do a forward reach and their step, so if it was my left hand, I reach forward with my left, I have my right leg forward and I hold that position and breathe. You could do that with the front side mechanics and the back side mechanics of a suitcase carry. Have them work on the ISO hold in that position and see if they can maintain position. So to summarize, Dan, because I kind of went real quick with that, I would make sure you're working on hip extension and shoulder extension, seeing if they can maintain the stack during that. Then I would go ISO holds of the suitcase carry. And once you got that, then you would go through the dynamical portion of the suitcase carry, and that should help your peeps maintain the stack position.